Hi, today I am reading you an email that I received lately. The email is about the story of US Marines who kicked the old veteran out of the first class seat. US Marines laughed at the old veteran's trembling hands at the range. The email says, "Whoa, whoa, cease fire, cease fire," the command bellowed across the firing line, not from a range safety officer, but from a young, cocky sergeant named Decker. He marched down the line of prone shooters, kicking up dust, until he stood over an elderly man in a faded boonie hat. The old man, Cal, was trying to feed a round into the chamber of a bolt-action rifle, but his hands were shaking so violently that the brass cartridge was clicking against the receiver like a telegraph key. "Click, click, click. Look at this," Decker announced, gesturing to his squad of snipers in training. "This is a negligent discharge waiting to happen. Hey, Pops, put the weapon down before you kill a bird or shoot your own toe off." Cal looked up, his eyes watery and blue, his hands still trembling. I'm just loading, son. I've got it." Decker laughed, reaching down and snatching the rifle right out of the old man's hands. "You don't got it. You got Parkinson's, or the DTs, or whatever it is old guys get. This is a precision range. 1,000 yards. You can't hit the broadside of a barn with those shakes." Decker held the rifle up, a vintage M40, the kind used in Vietnam, and sneered, "This belongs in a museum, and so do you. Get off my line." Folks, Decker thought he was clearing a safety hazard. He didn't know he was disarming a ghost. He didn't know that those trembling hands had once held a rifle steady in a rice paddy for 3 days straight without moving an inch. And he definitely didn't know that the sniper instructor watching from the tower was about to come down and teach everyone a lesson in ballistics. You need to see this. Stick around. The Stone Bay Rifle Range at Camp Lejeune is a place of worship for the Marine Corps. It's a cathedral of heat, humidity, and the smell of burning gunpowder. It was 0900 hours, and the air was already a thick, suffocating blanket that shimmered off the asphalt and created a mirage downrange, that wavy distortion of heat that makes a target at 1,000 yards look like it's dancing underwater. And today was Heritage Day, a rare event where the base opened the long-distance lanes to veterans and retirees, allowing the old breed to shoot alongside the new breed. But the atmosphere wasn't one of camaraderie. It was a segregated playground. On the left side of the range were the active duty scout snipers. They looked like cyborgs. They were prone on shooting mats, decked out in the latest gear, suppressed Mech 13 Mod 7 rifles, ballistic computers, Kestrel wind meters, and optics that cost more than a Honda Civic. They were young, fit, and arrogant, led by Sergeant Decker. Decker was 25, a physical specimen with a high and tight haircut and a sleeve of tattoos. He was the kind of shooter who trusted his technology more than his gut. He believed that if you punched the right numbers into the computer, the bullet had no choice but to hit. To him, sniping was math. It wasn't an art. On the right side of the range were the veterans. Most were shooting AR-15s or hunting rifles, laughing, swapping stories, happy just to smell the cordite again. But Cal was alone at the far end of the line. Lane 1. Cal didn't look like a warrior. He looked like a man the wind could blow over. He was 80 years old, wearing a khaki shirt that was buttoned wrong and a pair of suspenders. But the most noticeable thing about him was the tremor. It was a constant, rhythmic shaking of his hands and head, a neurological betrayal that made simple tasks like opening a water bottle an ordeal. He had brought a single rifle case, a beat-up hard-shell case that looked like it had been dragged behind a truck. Inside was a Remington 700, modified to M40 specs, Woodstock, Redfield 3x9 scope, no bipod, no ballistic computer, just wood and steel. Decker had been watching Cal since he arrived. To Decker, Cal was an eyesore, a liability, a reminder of a time when the call was sloppy. Decker walked over to his squad, pointing at Cal. "Check out the dinosaur in lane 1. Decker scoffed. "Look at him shake. He's going to rattle his fillings out. Why do they let these guys on the deck? It's embarrassing." A corporal next to Decker laughed. "Maybe he thinks the target is shaking too, Sergeant. If they both shake, maybe they cancel out." The squad erupted in laughter. They were the elite. They were the future. And this old man was just clutter. Cole tried to ignore them. He was focused on his breathing. Inhale, exhale. He knew the shakes were bad today. He hadn't taken his meds because they made his vision blurry, and he needed his eyes sharp for the 1000-yard line. He fumbled with a box of .308 rounds. He tried to pick one up, but his fingers spasmed and the round fell into the dirt. He reached for it, and his hand knocked the box over, spilling 20 rounds into the sand. "Oh, for God's sake," Decker shouted, marching over. This was the moment. The power move. Decker didn't help Cal pick up the rounds. He kicked dirt over them. "You're done, Pop," Decker said, towering over the kneeling veteran. "You can't handle the ammo. You can't handle the weapon. You are a safety violation." Cal looked up, shielding his eyes from the sun. "I'm fine, Sergeant. It's just a little tremor. It stops when I break the trigger. It stops when you break the trigger." Decker mocked. "That's not how physiology works. You're vibrating. You're going to send a round over the berm and hit a civilian in the parking lot. Pack it up." Cal stood up slowly. He reached for his rifle, the one Decker had snatched in the hook. "That's my rifle, son. I carried one just like it in 1968. I know how to use it." "In 1968, Decker sneered, holding the rifle out of reach. "Back when you guys were smoking dope in the jungle and spraying and praying. This is precision fire, old man. We calculate spindrift and Coriolis effect. You guys just guessed." Decker turned to the range. "All right, listen up. We're going to show this gentleman what real shooting looks like. Lane 2. Dial up 1,000 yards. Steel target. One shot, one kill. Show 'em how the professionals do it." A young sniper lay down, adjusted his $3,000 scope, checked his wind meter, and fired. Crack. A few seconds later, the faint ping of steel echoed back. "Impact," the spotter yelled. "Center mass." Decker turned back to Cal, a smug grin on his face. "See that? That's steady. That's discipline. Now, take your relic and go sit in the shade before you hurt yourself." Cal looked at the target in the distance. Then he looked at Decker. The old man's shaking seemed to stop for a split second, and his eyes hardened into steel. "That's a nice shot," Cal whispered, "but the target isn't moving." And nobody is shooting back. "Excuse me?" Decker stepped closer. "Are you critiquing my shooter? You can't even load your gun." "I can load it," Cal said softly, "and I can outshoot you." The silence on the range was instant. The wind seemed to stop. Decker blinked, unable to believe the audacity. You think you can outshoot me? A scout sniper instructor." Decker laughed, a harsh barking sound. "All right, you want to play? Fine, let's play." Decker turned to the tower. "Range control, we have a challenge. Clear the line." He shoved the rifle back into Cal's chest. "You want to be humiliated, old man? Step up, but don't blame me when you dislocate your shoulder missing the berm." What Decker didn't see was the slight smile on Cal's face. It was the smile of a man who knows a secret. It was the smile of a hunter who just watched the deer step into the trap. The challenge hung in the humid air of the Stone Bay rifle range, like the smell of ozone after a lightning strike. "You want to play? Fine, let's play." Sergeant Decker's words weren't an invitation. They were a sentence. The range went dead silent. The other shooters, both the active duty snipers on the left and the graying veterans on the right, stopped what they were doing. Ear protection was pulled off. Safety flags were checked. All eyes pivoted to lane 1, where a 25-year-old physical specimen was towering over an 80-year-old man who looked like he was vibrating apart at the seams. Decker turned to the crowd, spreading his arms wide, soaking in the attention like a lizard on a rock. "All right, listen up," he bellowed, his voice projecting easily to the back of the berm. "Training is suspended. We have a special demonstration today. This gentleman," he pointed at Cal with an exaggerated, mocking deference, "believes that the laws of physics don't apply to him. He believes that you don't need stability to shoot long range. He believes that a tremor is a tactical advantage." A ripple of laughter went through the squad of young scout snipers. They were the elite, the hog's tooth wearers, and to them Cal was a joke, a relic, a piece of driftwood that had washed up on their beach. "Clear lane 1 and 2, Decker ordered. "Set up a steel silhouette at 1,000 yards. Cold bore shot, 1 round. Winner takes the bragging rights. Loser, well, the loser packs up his trash and gets off my base." Cal didn't say a word. He looked down at his beat-up rifle case. He felt the eyes of the crowd on him. He felt the shame burning his neck, hot and prickly. He knew what they were seeing, a senile old man with a death wish. But Cal wasn't thinking about the crowd. He was thinking about the rifle inside the case. The M40. He knelt down to open the case, and this is where the humiliation became physical. For a young man, kneeling is a transition. For an 80-year-old man with 2 artificial knees and a fused lumbar vertebrae, kneeling is a calculated structural collapse. Cal winced as his knees hit the hot concrete. His hands, shaking violently from the Parkinsonian tremor, fumbled with the latches of the case. Click-clack rattle. He couldn't get the purchase to flip the latch. It slipped. He tried again. It slipped again. Decker watched, arms crossed, a smirk plastered on his face. "Need a mechanic, Pops? Or maybe a nurse?" "I got it," Cal grunted, sweat stinging his eyes. He used both thumbs, pressing down with all his might to stop the shaking, finally popping the latches. He opened the case. Inside lay the rifle. It wasn't a modern modular chassis system made of aircraft aluminum and carbon fiber. It was wood. Beautiful, oil-darkened walnut. The barrel was Parkerized steel, worn silver at the muzzle. The scope was an old Redfield 3x9 AccuRange, the anodizing turning a purplish hue from age. It looked like a hunting rifle. To the modern snipers, it looked like a toy. "Look at that musket," Decker scoffed, kicking the edge of the case. "Where's the ballistic computer? Where's the wind meter? Where's the bubble level? You planning to hunt deer or engage a target at a click?" Cal reached for the rifle. His hand hovered over the stock, vibrating. When he grabbed the grip, the whole weapon shook. The barrel tapped against the plastic case. Tap, 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 tap. The sound was amplifying his weakness. "You're shaking the finish off the gun," Decker laughed. "Seriously, go home. You're going to embarrass yourself." This is where most men would crack. They'd pack up. They'd cite a medical condition. They'd leave with their dignity shredded. But this veteran, he's built different. He's cut from the cloth of Case and Hahn. "Watch this." Cal ignored him. He reached into the case and pulled out a leather sling. Not a bipod, a sling. He began to loop it around his upper arm, cinching it tight, high in the armpit. This was the old way, the loop sling method. It cut off the circulation. It hurt like hell, but it locked the rifle to the body. "All right," Decker said, "bored now. Let's get this over with. I'll shoot first. Show you the wind. Consider it a courtesy." Decker grabbed his rifle, a Mink 13 Mod 7. It was a spaceship compared to Cal's canoe. Suppressed. Night Force ATAC-R scope, bipod with spiked feet. He lay down on the shooting mat with the grace of an athlete. He didn't just lie down, he flowed into position. He checked his Kestrel wind meter. "Wind is 4 miles per hour from 3 o'clock, Decker announced. "Humidity 85%. Barometric pressure 29.92. He punched the numbers into a ballistic calculator strapped to his wrist. Solution is 8.4 mils up, 0.6 mils right. He adjusted his scope turrets. Click, click, click. Precise, mechanical, soulless. He loaded a round. He settled in behind the rifle. His body was perfectly still. He looked like a statue. Fut crack. The suppressed shot was quiet. Just a puff of air, followed by the supersonic crack of the bullet downrange. 1 second, 2 seconds, ping. The sound of the bullet hitting the steel target at 1,000 yards drifted back to the firing line. A perfect center mass hit. The young Marines cheered. Textbook, one yelled. Dead center. Decker stood up, dusting off his elbows. He grinned at Cal. That, my friend, is how you manipulate the trajectory. Science, math, precision. Now, let's see you try to even find the target in that soda straw scope. It was Cal's turn. And this was the hardest part. Cal had to get prone. He stood there for a moment, looking at the concrete. He didn't have a shooting mat. He hadn't brought one. He had forgotten it in his rush to leave the house. Or maybe he just didn't think he deserved one. He had to lay his old brittle bones directly on the hot, abrasive concrete of the firing line. He groaned as he lowered himself. One hand on the ground, then a knee, then the hip. It was a slow, agonizing descent, like watching a building crumble in slow motion. The crowd watched in uncomfortable silence. It wasn't funny anymore. It was painful. A few of the older veterans on the right side of the line took a step forward, wanting to help, but Cal held up a shaking hand. Stop. He got his belly on the ground. The concrete burned through his thin khaki shirt. He pulled the rifle into his shoulder. The shaking didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. The physical exertion of getting down had spiked his heart rate. His left hand, supporting the forend of the rifle, was bouncing. The barrel of the rifle was drawing frantic little circles in the air. Decker walked up behind him, leaning over. Look at the muzzle, Decker whispered loudly to his squad. He's painting the whole berm. Hey, old-timer, the target is the steel plate, not the clouds. Cal tried to find the eye relief on the scope. His head was bobbing. The scope was winking black and clear. Black and clear. He couldn't get a sight picture. The sweat was pouring into his eyes now, stinging, blinding. He blinked, trying to clear his vision. He reached for the bolt to load a round. His hand missed the handle. He tried again. Clack. He pulled it back. He tried to drop a single point, 308 round, into the chamber. His fingers were like sausages, clumsy and disobedient. The round slipped and fell into the dirt beside the rifle. Strike one, Decker jeered. Do you want me to load it for you? Do you want a sippy cup too? Cal closed his eyes. He took a breath. He reached into the dirt, found the dusty cartridge, and wiped it on his sleeve. He guided it into the chamber, using his thumb to force it home. He closed the bolt. Click, clunk. The rifle was live. But the movement was catastrophic. The barrel was swaying like a tree branch in a gale. At 1,000 yards, a movement of 1 millimeter at the muzzle translates to missing the target by feet. Cal was moving by inches. You're wasting our time, Decker said, his voice losing its humor and becoming cold. You are physically incapable of making this shot. Just stand up. Admit that the technology and the training have passed you by. It's over, Cal. You're obsolete. If this disrespect makes your blood boil, you're in the right place. Because the storm isn't coming, the storm is already here. Cal lay there, the heat baking his back, the shame crushing his chest. He could hear the whispers. He can't do it. Someone help him up. This is sad. He looked through the scope. The crosshairs were dancing wildly. The target was a blurry grey smudge that kept jumping out of view. The tremor was winning. The age was winning. Decker was right. He was just a shaking old man with a museum piece. But then Cal closed his eyes again, and he stopped listening to Decker. He stopped feeling the concrete. He stopped feeling the shake. He went to the internal place, the place where the jungle hummed and the rain never stopped. Cole closed his eyes, and the world of the Stone Bay rifle range dissolved into a singular, vibrating frequency of white noise, the burning concrete under his elbows fading until it was indistinguishable from the scorched earth of the Quezon Valley in 1968, a sensory shift so profound that for a moment he actually smelled the rotting vegetation and the copper tang of old blood instead of the CLP gun oil and sunscreen of the modern Marine Corps. He didn't fight the tremor because fighting it was a fool's errand, a lesson he had learned 50 years ago when the adrenaline of being hunted by an MVA counter-sniper team had turned his hands into tuning forks, teaching him that the human body is not a statue of marble but a bag of water and electricity that is constantly in motion. Inside the fortress of his skull, the timeline collapsed, and the arrogant voice of Sergeant Decker mocking him from the tower became a distant buzzing fly, irrelevant to the lethal geometry he was currently constructing in his mind. And uptime, the shaking that Decker and the young shooters saw as a liability, a symptom of senility and weakness, was to Cal simply the engine idling, the resonant frequency of a nervous system that had been rewired by high explosives, and 3 tours of combat duty to never ever fully relax. In his internal world, Cal wasn't an 80-year-old man struggling to hold a rifle. He was a 20-year-old predator who had merged with the mud, a biological extension of the wood and steel in his hands. He visualized the wobble area, that fundamental concept of marksmanship that the young bucks with their ballistic computers tried to eliminate with technology, but that the old breed knew had to be embraced. He saw the crosshairs in his mind's eye, not as a stationary cross, but as a living thing, a figure 8 dancing over the target, a chaotic scribble of movement that could not be stopped but could be predicted. He remembered the voice of his old spotter, Miller, a kid from Alabama who could read the wind by watching the way a spiderweb trembled at 500 yards, whispering in his ear, "Don't fight the wobble, Cal. Ride the wave. The bullet knows the way. You just got to open the gate." That was the secret the digital generation had forgotten. You don't squeeze the trigger when the crosshair is perfect, because perfection is a myth. You squeeze the trigger when the crosshair is perfect, because perfection is a myth. You squeeze the trigger when the crosshair is moving toward perfection, anticipating the delay of the sear braking, the lock time of the firing pin, the ignition of the primer. It was a game of 4-dimensional chess played in milliseconds. The tremor in his hands was rhythmic, a sine wave of physiology, up, down, left, right, and Cal began to synchronize his breathing with the shake, inhaling as the muzzle rose, exhaling as it fell, turning the chaotic vibration into a predictable pattern. He wasn't trying to stop the earthquake, he was learning to shoot between the aftershocks. The pain in his fused lumbar vertebrae screamed, a hot poker driving into his spine, but he pushed it into a mental box labeled ignore, just as he had ignored the leech bites and the dysentery and the fear. He thought about the rifle, the M40. It wasn't just a tool, it was a Horcrux, a vessel containing the souls of the men he had saved and the men he had killed. The woodstock was warm against his cheek, a familiar lover that knew the shape of his face better than his own wife did. He felt the trigger guard against his calloused finger, the metal worn smooth. This rifle didn't have a ballistic computer to do the thinking for him. It demanded that he feel the atmosphere. He opened his sensory inputs to the wind, not looking at a digital meter, but feeling the temperature differential on the left side of his neck versus the right, noticing the way the heat mirage was boiling off the berm, a boil that indicated a subtle tailwind that the Kestrel meter might miss because it was happening at the apex of the bullet's trajectory, not at the shooter's position. Decker had dialed 0.6 mils right, based on the wind at the firing line, but Cal, deep in his trance, sensed a fishtailing wind downrange, a treacherous current that would push the bullet left at the 800-yard mark. The young sergeant was trusting the math of the launch. Cal was trusting the physics of the flight. The humiliation of the moment, the laughter of the squad, the dirt kicked on his ammo, the condescending offer of a sippy cup burned in his gut. But he transmuted that shame into focus, using the anger to sharpen his vision, clearing the milky haze of his cataracts through sheer force of will. He wasn't shooting to win a bet. He was shooting to validate an entire generation of warriors who had been discarded by a corps that now valued technology over instinct. He was shooting for Miller, who never made it home, who took a round through the neck while spotting for Cal, bleeding out in the elephant grass, while Cal held pressure and screamed for a corpsman who never came. One shot, one kill. The motto echoed in the cathedral of his mind. But for Cal, it was one shot, one ghost. Every time he broke a perfect shot, he felt Miller's hand on his shoulder. He settled deeper into the concrete, the loop sling cutting off the circulation in his upper arm, turning his left hand numb, which actually helped dampen the coarse tremors. Leaving only the fine motor vibrations, he visualized the bullet's path, a majestic arc of lead spiraling through the humidity, fighting gravity and air resistance. He saw the bullet spinning at 180,000 revolutions per minute, a gyroscope of death. He accepted that he could not hold the rifle steady. He accepted that the crosshair would never stop moving. He accepted that he was old and broken. And in that acceptance he found the stillness that existed in the eye of the storm. He began the final respiratory pause, the bottom of the breath, where the body is most stable, and he watched the reticle dancing. It was swinging high, right, low, left, and then, as he applied the pressure, barely 4 pounds of force, he waited for the reticle to swing across the center of the blurry grey smudge that was the target. He wasn't going to pull the trigger. He was going to ambush it. He was going to let the rifle fire itself. When the sine wave crossed zero, the internal monologue went silent. The ghost stopped screaming. The heat stopped burning. There was only the reticle, the rhythm, and the terrifying, beautiful certainty that he was about to do the impossible. He was no longer Cal, the trembling old man. He was the white feather's disciple. He was the reaper. He was the wind. And as the crosshair drifted toward the center mass of the steel plate, Cal didn't think about winning. He thought about teaching. He thought about showing these boys that the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield isn't the rifle with the computer on it. It's the rifle held by the man who has nothing left to lose. The shake was the timer. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Now, the heat radiating off the concrete firing line at Camp Lejeune ceased to be the humidity of North Carolina and instantly morphed into the suffocating, wet wool blanket of the Quezon Valley. September 1968. The smell of CLP gun oil and sunscreen vanished, replaced by the pungent, metallic stench of rotting vegetation, water buffalo dung, and the copper tang of fear that coats the back of your throat and never really washes away. Carl wasn't an 80-year-old man with Parkinson's anymore. The years melted off his bones, leaving him a 20-year-old lance corporal, starved, dehydrated, and vibrating with a level of adrenaline that borders on toxicity. He was lying prone in a hide site carved out of the roots of a massive banyan tree, his ghillie suit, a heavy sodden mass of burlap and local foliage that crawled with ants and leeches. Beside him, peering through a spotting scope that was fogging up in the heat, was Miller, the ghost who had been whispering to him on the modern range. But here, Miller was alive, a 19-year-old kid from Alabama with a plug of tobacco in his cheek and eyes that could spot a tick on a deer at 500 yards. They had been in this hide for 72 hours. No sleep, no movement, just the agonizing stillness of the hunter waiting for the wolf. They were hunting a legend. The Marines called him the Cobra. He was an NVA counter-sniper who had been chewing up Charlie Company for weeks. He didn't just kill, he surgically dismantled morale. He shot radio men, he shot corpsmen, he shot the point man, and then waited for the rescue team. He was a ghost in the canopy, and Cal and Miller were the exorcists sent to dig him out. But the stress of the stalk had broken Cal's body, the lack of sleep, the dehydration, and the sheer crushing weight of responsibility had given him the shakes. His hands were trembling uncontrollably. His rifle, the same M40 he held now in the future, felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "I can't do it, Miller," Cal whispered, the sound barely audible over the drone of the cicadas. He was staring through the Redfield scope, watching the reticle bounce all over the green wall of the jungle opposite their position. "Look at me. I'm vibrating. I'm going to miss. I'm going to give away our position and get us killed." Miller didn't look away from his spotting scope. He just shifted his chew and whispered back, his voice a low, calm drawl that sounded like home. "You ain't gonna miss, Cal. You're just terrified. That's natural. Your body is trying to run, but your mind is making you stay. That tension, that's just energy looking for a place to go. It's not energy, it's a seizure," Cal hissed, wiping sweat from his eye. "The crosshair is jumping 3 feet at 600 yards. If I take the shot, I graze him and he puts a 7.62 through my eye socket." "Then don't try to stop it," Miller said. And this was the lesson. This was the moment the philosophy changed. "You're trying to be a statue, Cal. You ain't made of stone. You're made of meat and blood. The more you fight the shake, the worse it gets. It's like a riptide. You fight the current, you drown, you swim with it, you survive." He left a piece of his soul back there in those roots. And folks, you need to understand that the man lying on the concrete range isn't just remembering a technique. He is reliving the moment he learned to dance with death. Suddenly, Miller stiffened. "Got him," Miller whispered, the playfulness vanishing from his voice. "Reference point, the burnt stump. Go right 4 mils, up 2 mils, deep in the bamboo. Just the glint of a lens. He's setting up on the patrol." Cal swung the rifle. The movement was jerky. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Thump, thump, thump. The vibrations traveled down his arm and into the stock of the rifle. He found the burnt stump. He tracked right. He saw it. A tiny, unnatural shadow in the bamboo. The glint of glass. The cobra was there, and he was facing them. "Range 650, Miller murmured. "Wind is dead calm. He's looking for us, Cal. He knows we're here. You got about 3 seconds before he scans this tree." Cal tried to hold the crosshair on the shadow. The wobble was terrible. Up, down, left, right. It was a figure 8 of panic. "I can't hold it. I can't hold it." "Ride the wave," Miller whispered, his voice right in Cal's ear. "Don't squeeze when it's perfect. There is no perfect. Squeeze when it's swinging past the kill zone. Time the shake, Cal. Make the shake the timer. Tick-tock, tick-tock." Cal stopped fighting. He let his muscles go loose. He let the tremor take over. He watched the rhythm. The crosshair rose above the target, then dipped below, then rose again. It was a pattern, a deadly rhythmic sine wave. Inhale, the crosshair went high. Exhale, the crosshair dropped. Pause, the crosshair swept across the center of the shadow. Cal didn't pull the trigger. He didn't jerk it. He just applied pressure as the reticle began its downward swing, knowing that by the time the sear broke and the firing pin hit the primer, the crosshair would be dead center. He trusted the movement. He trusted the chaos. Crack! The rifle bucked into his shoulder, the recoil breaking the tension. "Hit!" Miller yelled, forgetting operational silence. "Pink missed. You nailed him. You thwack." The sound was distinct. It was the sound of a bullet hitting meat. "Not the enemy." Miller stopped talking. Cal froze. He looked over. The cobra hadn't been alone. There was a second shooter, a spotter, and he had fired the moment Cal's muzzle flash gave them away. Miller slumped forward over his spotting scope, a dark, jagged hole in his neck. The blood pumped out in spurts. black and shiny in the jungle light, soaking into the mud of the hide site. "Miller!" Cal screamed, dropping the rifle, scrambling over to his friend. He clamped his hands over the wound, trying to hold the blood in, trying to fix the unfixable. "Miller, stay with me. Don't you quit. I got him. I got the cobra. You hear me?" Miller looked at Cal. His eyes were wide, filled with shock, but fading fast. He tried to speak, but only a wet gurgle came out. He reached up with a blood-slicked hand and gripped Cal's shirt, the same khaki shirt Cal was wearing on the range, 50 years later. Miller's lips moved. "You keep shooting." And then the light went out. The best spotter in the division, the kid who taught Cal how to turn fear into precision, was dead. Cal lay there for 2 days, next to the body, waiting for extraction, surrounded by the NVA, holding his rifle with hands that shook so hard he couldn't drink from his canteen. But he didn't die, he didn't break, he watched the jungle, and every time a shadow moved, he used the wobble, he used the rhythm Miller taught him. He stacked bodies around that tree until his ammo ran dry. Keep listening, because that piece of his soul is about to come back to the surface. The shot he is about to take on the Stone Bay Range isn't for bragging rights. It's the final salute. The sensory overload of the flashback receded, snapping back to the present with the violence of a rubber band. The smell of the jungle vanished, replaced by the heat of the North Carolina asphalt. The sound of the cicadas was replaced by the silence of the crowd watching him. Cal was back in his 80-year-old body. The pain in his back was screaming. The tremor in his hands was violent. Sergeant Decker was standing behind him, mocking him. The target was 1,000 yards away, but Cal wasn't alone. He felt a weight on his right shoulder, a familiar pressure. It was Miller. The ghost was right there, spotting for him one last time. "Wind is fishtailing." Cal, the voice in his head, whispered, "Don't trust the tech, trust the feeling, ride the wave, make the shake the timer." Cal watched the reticle dancing over the blurred steel target. It was moving fast, left, right. To Decker, it looked like a seizure. To Cal, it looked like a pendulum. He began to apply pressure to the trigger. The trigger was crisp, set to 2.5 pounds. He needed to time it perfectly. He needed to be the water, not the rock. The crosshair swung from the left edge of the target, moving toward the center. Tick. It crossed the center. Tick. He added the final ounce of pressure. The internal world of the veteran is a scary place. It's a haunted house where the doors never lock, but it's also a forge. And right now, Cal was pulling the iron out of the fire. He wasn't shaking from weakness. He was vibrating with the power of 1968. Send it. The break of the trigger on a vintage Remington 700 M40 is not a mechanical click. It is the snapping of a glass rod, a crisp, singular event that severs the shooter's connection to the weapon and hands the fate of the bullet over to the laws of physics. For Cal, lying in the dirt with his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, that snap was the sound of a promise being kept. The firing pin struck the primer, the powder ignited, and in the span of milliseconds, the 173-grain match-grade bullet was shoved down the 24-inch barrel, engaging the lands and grooves of the rifling, spinning up to a rotational velocity of over 180, 000 RPM. Crack. The rifle bucked into Cal's shoulder, a sharp, familiar kick that punished his arthritic collarbone, but felt strangely like a hug from an old friend. The muzzle blast kicked up a cloud of dust from the concrete firing line, momentarily obscuring the view. To the naked eye, it was just a noise and a puff of smoke. But to the trained eye, and there were a dozen pairs of trained eyes watching through high-end optics, it was the beginning of a narrative arc that shouldn't have been possible. The bullet left the muzzle at 2,600 feet per second. It punched through the supersonic barrier, creating a miniature sonic boom that trailed behind it like a ghost. Sergeant Decker, standing with his arms crossed, shook his head as the shot broke. He had seen the muzzle sway. He had seen the tremors. In his mind, the math was impossible. A rifle moving that much at the firing line would result in a miss of 10, maybe 20 feet at 1,000 yards. He was already composing his insult, ready to tell the old man to pack up his musket and get off the deck. He looked down at his spotting scope, not to confirm a hit, but to see where the dirt would fly up, to see how badly the old man had missed. But the bullet didn't care about Decker's math. It only cared about Cal's timing. The projectile soared over the 500-yard line, climbing to the apex of its trajectory, nearly 12 feet above the line of sight. This is where the magic happened. This is where the fishtailing wind that Cal had sensed, the one the kestrel meter on the ground couldn't read, grabbed the bullet. Decker had calculated for a steady push from the right, but the air up there was turbulent, a chaotic river of heat and pressure. If Cal had aimed steady, if he had used the perfect hold that Decker suggested, the wind would have slapped that bullet 3 feet to the left. But Cal hadn't aimed steady. He had released the shot while the barrel was swinging right, riding the wave of his own tremor. He had essentially thrown the bullet into the wind, correcting for the drift before it even happened, using his own instability as a countermeasure. It was a technique so old, so dangerous, and so intuitive that it hadn't been taught in a sniper school since the Nixon administration. The crowd stood in silence. The flight time of a .308 round to 1,000 yards is approximately 1.5 seconds. 1 Mississippi, the bullet began its descent. Gravity grabbed it, pulling it down from the sky. It dropped below the speed of sound, entering the transonic zone, a destabilizing buffer of air that usually makes bullets wobble and tumble. But the heavy 173-grain projectile, spun by the old-school rifling twist of the M40, held its line. It bored through the heat mirage. 2 Mississippi, pang! The sound was faint, carried back on the wind, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't the dull thud of a bullet hitting the dirt berm. It wasn't the crack of a bullet passing overhead. It was the high-pitched, resonant ring of lead smashing into hardened AR-500 steel. The silence on the range didn't break. It deepened. It was the silence of a magic trick that nobody can explain. Decker froze. His mouth, which had been opened to deliver a scathing critique, hung slack. He jammed his eye into his spotting scope, cranking the focus ring, desperate to prove his ears wrong. "No way," he muttered. "No fricking way. That was a ricochet. That was a fluke." He scanned the target. The white steel silhouette stood stark against the dark earth of the backstop. And there, painted in the grey smudge of pulverized lead, was a fresh hit. It wasn't a graze. It wasn't an edge hit. It wasn't a lucky strike on the shoulder. The splash mark was dead center, high chest, right where the heart would be. A 10-ring shot. The bully thinks it's luck. He thinks the universe just made a mistake. He is about to learn that luck is just preparation meeting opportunity. Impact, the spotter from the active duty squad whispered, his voice trembling slightly. Target is hit center mass. The squad of young snipers looked at each other. They looked at their ballistic computers. They looked at their wind meters. The data said miss. The wind call was wrong. The stability was wrong. The equipment was wrong. But the steel didn't lie. Carl didn't move. He stayed prone on the concrete, the rifle still tucked into his shoulder, executing the follow-through. He cycled the bolt, click-clack, ejecting the spent brass casing. It spun through the air and landed on the concrete with a musical ting. Smoke curled slowly from the chamber. Carl took a deep breath, letting the tension drain out of his muscles. The tremor returned instantly, his hands shaking as he released the grip. But for that one singular moment of violence, he had been as still as the grave. He looked up at the tower, then over at Decker. Decker was staring at him. The smirk was gone. In its place was a look of profound, terrifying confusion. It was the look of a man who has just seen a ghost walk through a wall. You, Decker stammered, stepping closer, looking at the rifle as if it were a cursed object. How? You were shaking like a leaf. You were all over the place. That scope, it's garbage. How did you make that call? Carl slowly rolled onto his side, wincing as his stiff joints protested. He sat up, wiping the sweat and grime from his face with a shaking hand. He looked old again, frail, but his eyes were clear, burning with a quiet, dangerous intelligence. The wind, Carl rasped, his voice rough from the heat. It's fishtailing at the apex. You can't see it on your meter, son. You have to feel it on your neck. You have to see the boil. The boil, Decker asked, blinking. The mirage. The air tells you what to do, Carl said, tapping his chest. You boys, you're looking at your wrists. You're looking at your screens. You stop looking at the world. Carl pointed a trembling finger downrange. That bullet has to live in the air for a second and a half. If you don't know the air, you don't know the shot. Decker looked at the target again through his scope. Center mass. It was a shot that would have guaranteed a pass in any sniper course in the world, and it was made by a man who couldn't pour a cup of coffee without spilling it. The crowd of veterans on the right side of the line erupted. It started as a slow clap, one guy in a wheelchair hitting his hands together, and then it grew. Cheers, whistles. That's how it's done, someone yelled. Old Corps, yelled another. But Carl didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He wasn't shooting for the applause. He was shooting for the silence. He looked at Decker, whose face was flushing, a deep, humiliated crimson. You want to go again, Sergeant? Carl asked softly. Or are you done kicking dirt on my ammo? Decker swallowed hard. He looked at his high-tech rifle, then at Carl's battered wood stock. The power dynamic had shifted so violently it made the air spin. Decker was the instructor. He was the authority, but he had just been taken to school. Decker started, his ego warring with his reality. I want to see you do it again. 1 shot is luck, 2 shots is skill, 3 shots is a firing solution. Carl nodded. Fair enough. He reached for another round. His hand shook. He fumbled it. He dropped it. The young snipers didn't laugh this time. Not a single sound. Decker watched Carl struggle to pick up the round. And this time, Decker didn't kick dirt on it. He didn't mock him. He watched with a morbid, intense fascination. He was watching a magician reveal the trick, but he still couldn't see the wires. Carl loaded the round. Click-clunk. He settled in. The shake returned. The barrel wobbled. The crowd held its breath. Crack. 1.5 seconds. Ping. The second shot hit the steel. Impact. The spotter yelled, his voice rising in disbelief. 3 inches from the first hit. Grouping. Carl cycled the bolt. Loaded a third round. Shake. Wobble. Breathe. Crack. Ping. 3 shots. 3 hits. A grouping the size of a tea saucer at 1,000 yards. With a shaking hand. With a 50-year-old rifle. With no computer. Carl slowly pushed himself up to a sitting position. He was exhausted. The adrenaline dump was fading, leaving him trembling even harder than before. He looked up at Decker. 3 shots, Carl whispered. Is that a solution, Sergeant? Or do I need to empty the box? Decker stood there, stripped of his armor. He looked at his squad, who were looking at Carl with wide, awestruck eyes. He looked at the target. He looked at the old man. This was the moment. Decker had a choice. He could double down on his arrogance, claim the equipment was rigged, claim it was a trick, or he could accept the death of his ego and learn something. Decker slowly uncrossed his arms. He walked over to Carl. He didn't tower over him this time. He knelt down. He got in the dirt. He looked Carl in the eye, seeing the cataracts, the wrinkles, the pain, and for the first time, he saw the sniper beneath the skin. The boil, Decker whispered, his voice humble for the first time all day. Show me, Show me what you saw. The atmosphere on the Stone Bay rifle range had shifted from a carnival of mockery to a cathedral of reverence, the silence so profound that the distant car of a crow sounded like a gunshot. Sergeant Decker was on his knees in the dirt, his expensive tactical pants stained with the red clay of North Carolina, looking up at Carl not as a nuisance but as an oracle. The 3 fresh splash marks on the steel target at 1,000 yards were still shimmering in the heat mirage, a physical testament to a feat that Decker's ballistic computer said was impossible. The young sergeant, who 10 minutes ago had offered Carl a sippy cup, was now asking for the holy grail of marksmanship, the reed. The boil, Decker repeated, his voice stripped of all its bravado, leaving only the raw hunger of a shooter who realizes he knows nothing. Show me what you saw. My Kestrel says the wind is steady. My computer says hold right. You held left. And you were moving, how? Carl looked down at the young Marine. He saw the confusion in Decker's eyes, the panic of a man whose reliance on technology had blinded him to the art of the kill. Carl didn't gloat. He didn't rub salt in the wound. He knew that humiliation is a teacher, but grace is a master. Get up, Sergeant, Carl said softly, his voice trembling but his tone commanded. Stop kneeling. You're not praying. You're learning. Carl gestured to the M40, lying on the concrete, the heat waves radiating off the barrel. Lie down behind the rifle. My rifle. Decker hesitated. To a sniper, a rifle is a personal extension of the body. Shooting another man's weapon is like wearing another man's boots. But he nodded, moving to the shooting position. He laid his body down on the hot concrete, wincing slightly as the heat soaked through his uniform, a small taste of the pain Carl had been enduring for 20 minutes. He reached for the M40. The moment Decker's hands touched the woodstock, he felt the difference. The sewed away Tolossal, his own rifle, the Mech-13, was a cold alien thing of aluminum and polymer, a chassis designed by engineers. This rifle, this M40, felt alive. It was warm. The walnut stock was smooth, polished by the sweat and oil of 50 years. It felt heavy, dense, and unforgiving. There was no adjustable cheekpiece. There was no pistol grip to ergonomically fit his hand. It was a club that threw lead. Where's the bipod? Decker asked instinctively, his hand groping the forend for the familiar spring-loaded legs that would stabilize the weapon. There is no bipod, Carl said, standing over him like a ghost. Bipods get snagged in the vines. Bipods sink in the mud. You are the bipod, son. Use the sling. Decker looked at the leather loop sling. He struggled to figure it out. It wasn't the tactical bungee slings he was used to. Carl reached down, his shaking hands fumbling for a moment before finding the leather keeper. He cinched it tight around Decker's left bicep, high up in the armpit. He pulled it so tight, Decker gasped. It cuts off the blood, Decker complained, wincing. It's supposed to, Carl replied. Pain is a reference point. If it hurts, you know it's tight. If it's tight, the rifle becomes part of your arm bone. It locks the radius and ulna into a triangle. Geometry, Sergeant. Stronger than muscle. Decker gritted his teeth, accepting the pain. He pulled the buttstock into his shoulder. He tried to get a sight picture. He looked through the Redfield 3x9 scope. It was like looking through a dirty drinking straw compared to his Night Force ATACR. The field of view was narrow. The glass was yellowed. There were no illuminated reticles, no Christmas tree holdover grids, just a simple, fine crosshair. I can barely see the target, Decker muttered, squinting. The eye relief is terrible. Stop looking at the scope, Carl instructed. Look through it. You're trying to read the data. There is no data. There is only the target and the air. Carl knelt down beside him, ignoring the screaming pain in his own artificial knees. He pointed a trembling finger downrange. Don't look at the target. Look at the air above the target, about 4 feet up. Tell me what you see. Decker adjusted his focus. He stared at the shimmering waves of heat rising from the ground. I see the mirage, Decker said. It's boiling, straight up. That's the lie, Cal whispered. That's the ground heat. Look higher. Look where the bullet lives. At the apex, 500 yards out, 15 feet up. Decker strained his eyes. He focused on the blurry tree line in the distance, trying to catch the distortion. And then he saw it. A subtle chaotic ripple. It wasn't moving right, like the wind at the firing line. It was swirling. It was flicking back and forth, like the tail of an angry cat. It's switching, Decker whispered, a dawn of realization breaking over his face. It's pushing left. Hard, but only for a second. Fishtailing, Cal confirmed. The valley funnel effect. The berms create a vacuum. Your electronic meter down here is reading the air in the parking lot, but the bullet has to fly through the river up there. You were dialing for the calm, but shooting into the storm. Decker looked up at Carl, stunned. How did you feel that? You didn't even look through the spotting scope. Carl tapped the side of his neck. The hair, he said. The wind touched the left side of my neck, cooler than the right, just a fraction of a degree, and I watched the grass on the 600-yard berm. It bowed, just once, against the grain. The world speaks to you, Sergeant, if you take the earbuds out. This is the moment. The torch passes. It's not about the shooting, it's about the seeing. The young warrior realizes he has been blind. Now, Carl said, his voice hardening, shoot it, but don't you dare try to hold it still. You can't. You don't have a bipod. You have a pulse. You have muscle tension. You are going to wobble. Decker tried to steady the rifle. He flexed his core. He tightened his grip, but the crosshair danced. It wasn't the violent tremor Carl had, but it was the figure 8 of a human body under tension. The reticle floated off the target. Decker fought it. He muscled the rifle back. It jumped away. He was fighting the current. Relax, Cal ordered. You're fighting the ocean, son. You'll drown. Let it move. Watch the pattern, Decker exhaled. He loosened his grip. The wobble increased, but it became rhythmic. Up, right, down, left. I can't get a lock, Decker admitted, frustration leaking into his voice. There is no lock, Cal said. There is only the rhythm. Time it. Make the wobble your timer. When it swings past the center, break the glass. Decker watched the reticle. He stopped trying to force it to the center. He watched it swing. He felt the rhythm. Tick, tock. The crosshair swung low, then began to rise, heading for the chest of the steel silhouette. He applied pressure. 2 pounds, 3 pounds. The crosshair was almost there. Now the trigger broke. Crack. The recoil of the M40 was sharper than his suppressed rifle. It shoved him back. The scope bucked. He lost the sight picture. He scrambled to get back on target. 1 second, 2 seconds. Ping. A hit. Not dead center. It was high right, on the shoulder of the target. But it was a hit. Decker let out a breath. He didn't know he was holding. He looked at the rifle in his hands with a new sense of awe. He hadn't calculated that shot. He hadn't dialed it. He had felt it. He had surrendered to the physics instead of trying to conquer them. He looked up at Cal. I felt it, Decker whispered. I felt the break. You aimed right, Cal critiqued, his tone that of a demanding instructor. You didn't trust the wind fully. You tried to hedge your bet. You aimed at the edge instead of holding off into the empty air. Decker nodded, accepting the correction. Yes, I did. I was afraid to aim at nothing. Sniping is an act of faith, Sergeant, Cal said, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead with a shaking hand. You have to trust that the invisible forces will do what they always do. The computer gives you a solution, the wind gives you a suggestion, but your gut, Your gut gives you the truth. The squad of young snipers had gathered around, their arrogance completely evaporated. They were watching a master class. They looked at the old wood rifle, then at their high-tech gear, and suddenly the batteries and the wires seemed fragile. They realized that if the batteries died, they were blind. But Carl was never blind. Decker slowly unhooked the sling. His arm was throbbing, his circulation returning in painful pins and needles. He handed the rifle back to Cal. He didn't just hand it over, he presented it, holding it with two hands, muzzle safe, offering it like a sword to a king. It's a fine weapon, Corporal, Decker said, using Cal's old rank, a sign of ultimate respect. It shoots, true. Cal took the rifle. His hands were shaking violently again, now that the focus was broken. The rifle rattled in his grip, but Decker didn't laugh. He didn't mock. He reached out and steadied the barrel with his own hand, helping the old man guide it back into the case. I apologize, Decker said, his voice loud enough for the whole range to hear. He stood up, dusting off his knees, and looked Carl in the eye. I disrespected you. I judged the book by the cover. I thought the shake made you weak. Decker looked at his own steady hands. I see now. The shake is just the cost of doing business. It's the engine idling. Cal looked at the young sergeant. He saw the potential there. He saw a kid who was arrogant, yes, but who was willing to learn. He saw a kid who had just eaten humble pie and asked for seconds. That was the mark of a leader. We all shake, son, Cal said, closing the latches on the case. Some on the outside, some on the inside. The trick isn't to stop the shaking. The trick is to not let it pull you off target. Decker nodded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a coin. It was a heavy bronze challenge coin with the Scout Sniper logo, the skull and crossbones embossed on one side. It was a unit coin, usually reserved for team members. He held it out. I can't give you back the ammo I kicked dirt on, Decker said, a flush of shame coloring his neck. But I'd be honored if you'd take this. Consider it a range fee. Carl looked at the coin. He reached out with his trembling fingers. He pinched the coin. He didn't drop it. He slipped it into his pocket. I'll keep it, Carl said. But you owe me a box of match grade .308. And none of that cheap surplus stuff. I want the federal gold medal. Decker laughed, a genuine relieved laugh. Done. I'll have a crate in your trunk before you leave the parking lot. Cal picked up his rifle case. The squad snapped to attention, not a formal drill command, but a spontaneous reaction to presence. They made a hole for him to walk through. As Cal walked past the high-tech rifles and the ballistic computers, he didn't look like a relic anymore. He looked like the standard. He walked with a limp, his head bobbing with the tremor, but he carried the weight of history with a lightness that shamed them all. He stopped at the edge of the concrete and looked back at Decker. One more thing, Sergeant, Cal called out. Decker straightened up. Yes, Corporal, that Kestrel wind meter you got? Cal pointed to the expensive device hanging on Decker's vest. It's a nice tool, but batteries die. Cal tapped his own temple. This doesn't keep your head on a swivel. And watch the boil. Aye, Corporal, Decker replied. He watched the old man walk away toward the parking lot, the heat mirage swallowing him up until he looked like a ghost returning to the fog. And Decker turned back to his squad. They were looking at him, waiting for orders. Decker looked at his Mink 13 rifle. He looked at the ballistic computer on his wrist. He unstrapped the computer and shoved it into his pocket. He turned off the wind meter. All right, listen up, Decker barked, his voice filled with a new kind of intensity. Turn them off. All of them. Computers off. Kestrel's off. The squad looked confused. Sergeant, you heard me, Decker ordered. We've been shooting math problems. Today we learn to shoot rifles. Tape over the screens. We are going to read the wind. We are going to watch the boil. And if I see anyone looking at a battery instead of the grass, you're running till you puke. Decker lay back down on the concrete. He looked through his scope. He didn't look for the numbers. He looked for the river in the sky. And for the first time in his career, he felt the wobble. And he smiled. Cal made it to his truck, a rusted-out Ford F-150 that had seen better days. Much like its owner, he slid the rifle case onto the passenger seat, treating it with more tenderness than he treated himself. He sat there for a moment, the air conditioning blasting against his sweat-soaked face, his hands still trembling on the steering wheel. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was always there. He looked at the empty passenger seat. It wasn't really empty, though. In his mind, Miller was sitting there, grinning, a fresh chew in his cheek. "We showed him, Miller," Carl whispered to the ghost. "We showed him the wobble." He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel pride. He just felt light. For the first time in 50 years, the weight of the jungle felt a little lighter. He had passed the knowledge on. He hadn't let the old ways die with him. He put the truck in gear and rolled slowly out of the parking lot, leaving the Stone Bay Range behind. He didn't need to look back. He knew what was happening back there. He knew Decker was taping over the screens. He knew the next generation was learning to see the wind. Listen to me closely. That right there, that is the tragedy and the glory of the veteran. We live in a world that is obsessed with the new phones, new cars, new tactics. We look at an old man with shaking hands and we see broken. We see a liability. We see someone who needs to get out of the way. But Sergeant Decker learned the hard truth today. The shake isn't weakness. The shake is the receipt. That tremor in Cal's hand, that's the adrenaline of 1968 that never left his system. That's the cost of holding the line when the world was burning. That's the engine idling on a race car that has been redlining for 50 years. You don't judge a warrior by how still he stands in a room. You judge him by what he hits when the trigger breaks. But we have an entire generation of young men and women who are glued to their screens, trusting the algorithm, trusting the battery. But batteries die, GPS signals fail, and when the lights go out, who do you want on the wall? Do you want the kid who needs a calculator to figure out the shot? Or do you want the old man who can feel the wind on the back of his neck and knows exactly when to ride the wave? Respect the old breed. They didn't have the tech, so they had to have the guts. They are the living libraries of warfare. If you see a veteran shaking, don't laugh. Don't look away. Shake his hand. You might just feel the electricity of history. If you're still with me, if you felt that impact downrange, do me a favor, hit that like button for Miller. Subscribe to the channel so we can keep telling the stories the world tries to delete. And in the comments, I want you to write, "Ride the wave." Let's fill the comments with respect for the shooters who didn't need a computer to find the 10 ring. Until next time, Semper Fi, check your wind,